Fun. So, James, go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell you all about how to make amazing pixel art.
Truth be told, I changed the name without telling anybody. I'm bad about it. It's okay. Hi, I am James Mitchell Weisbecker. I'm just going to go ahead and switch to this slide. It'll be easier though. Um, I am a graphic artist. What do I do? Yes, but mostly I get hired for pixel art. Um, Having said that, because I dabble in so many different things, able to kind of like move around to different projects whenever people need me for stuff. Um, and as you can see from the picture, I also dabble in making puppets. Bit of a odd one there, but hey, that's how that goes. Anyways, um, what is dynamic pixel art? Well, as Captain Falcon is telling you here, a lot of things. But first, we need to talk about uh, elephant in the room. What it's not, because program art, we all do it to some degree. Um, we all know a little bit about making pixel art if you've ever tried to make a 2D game, but we always want to replace that stuff. It's usually the thing we want to try and make better if we can, but we don't always have the best idea on how. Here's some of the things you can avoid. These are important, and we will talk about how to do better later. Mixels. I don't actually know how to fix this. This is kind of one of those things, just avoid it outright, where you have things that are off of your screen's resolution or pixel grid, what have you, that are scaled up really big or scaled down smaller than each other. It's I don't really have much to say about it other than just avoid it as best you can. Next up is pillow shading. This is the thing where you create something by just you start at the darkest shade and then you go from the edges of your object and then add a next shade. And then from the edge of that, you add the next shade until you fill it in. This, you don't want to do this because there's no lighting form. There's no true shading. It kind of just doesn't look like much of anything. It's especially true on this thing where you can see it really come out right here, but the next panel is where you can really see it. Muddy colors, where you don't vary things from saturation and contrast. Everything's the same hue value. Like if you were to grayscale this screenshot, everything would look exactly the same. That's something that you learn in illustration, where you will put a color filter, set it to black, and then just look at the whole illustration grayscale. That way you can figure out what things stand out, what don't, and what things are too close to each other color-wise. It's really important with pixel art to remember that, because you need to make sure that each part of your game stands out for a particular reason. We will get to that, though. Effectively, though, we just don't want to do this. This is funny comic that some people I look up to made years ago. But you can see here, this is basically all of those problems at once. Yeah. So let's move on to how do we make this stuff? What programs do we use? Please don't use MS Paint. I know that there's a lot of people who are probably using MS Paint. There are people who still use it professionally. I don't know who you are, but you are a very brave person. I don't know how you're animating anything. Having said that, though, graphic scale is what I use. It is a very old program at this point. I want to say it's from the 90s, but it still runs pretty well. It looks nice. Like all of the features you really need, like onion skinning, layers, animation frames, are all there. It doesn't have a whole lot of new features, but like, I mean, it hasn't really gotten an update in a very long time either. So either way, very stable tool of the trade. I've had a hard time switching from it because I've been using it over 20 years. So that's how that goes. ProMotion is the new kid on the block, and it's very, very, very good if you can get to grips with it. It was used for the creation of Shovel Knight, which I'm sure most of you here know. Um, the UI is very customizable. Basically, anything on the screen that you see there, you can move it around. You can even move it over to the other monitor if you want. It doesn't really care. Having said that, it is very complicated, and it has a couple of like functionality things that are like Photoshop, but then sometimes it's not Photoshop. Either way, like, I'm still trying to learn it because it has a couple of things I really want. Moving on, though, this is the one most people have probably heard of, which is Sprite. I like this program. I haven't really used it much. I think it's really nice, and like it does pretty much everything you need it to do. The pixel perfect line drawing tool is one of the big things that came with it, and was the first program to implement it. Basically, it means when you're drawing a line with your mouse or with your tablet, it doesn't have extra stray pixels that come across whenever you're doing it. It will always draw a perfect line. It does a little bit of smoothing. Sometimes you want to turn it on, sometimes you want to turn it off. Either way, very, very, very useful feature, especially for anyone who's getting started with this stuff. And you can use this professionally. It's very good. Other programs, these I don't know, like a couple of these I don't know as much about. Specifically, GraphX2 and Paint.net. GraphX2 I know from like a few people I've talked to. It is absolutely insane, but unless you feel like working with something that's from the days of the Amiga, I don't really suggest it. It is a very, very old school program. And Paint.net is basically just MS Paint if you have like layers and more advanced functionality and things like that. You can use it and it'll probably like get you where you need to be. Like if you just want something simple. Then we get to Clip Studio and Photoshop, which neither are built for pixel art, but they do actually work really well for it. Clip Studio, especially, people make a lot of brushes for it to do pixel art within the program, and it oddly has a palette tool for like setting up colors and things. And in Photoshop, well, you can do this in Clip Studio and Photoshop as long the indexed HD pixel art technique. I'll talk about that later if anybody wants to know more about it. But basically, any program that has a posterized layer, a gradient map layer, and the ability to do patterns can do this technique. So it's a really fun one. It lets you do backgrounds real easy. So, shade control. This is the big one, and we're officially getting into like how to make this stuff. Shade control is the second, I want to say the second most important part of all of this, because you don't want to work with something that has a whole bunch of extra colors. Like if you're dealing with an image that has hundreds of colors, it's going to be really hard to edit something at a much smaller size, because you'll be selecting the colors, trying to edit it, and then if you wanted to change the color at any point or another, you're going to have to deal with the fact that, oh, there's hundreds of colors here. So we usually want to stick to shade ranges of around, of like, max 10, just so that we can work with it. But if you have multiple different colors, then you're going to use around like anywhere from 8 to 4 or sometimes even 2 shades per color. There are a couple of different ways to do this. A lot of it comes down to like, color palette, color theory sort of things. Like, don't use too many colors. The 743 rule is something that came from I want to say, was the company Cave? I believe it was the company Cave, where they would use this for like most every sprite, where you have a main color that would have 7 shades, a secondary color that used 4, and then your tertiary, which was usually like a metal or something that was used pretty much everywhere, that would just be 3 shades. And then, like, if you just have something that's mainly 1 or just 2 colors, you can go a little further with it just because you want some extra shading or something like that. Now, banding is the big thing, and it's the really, really easy mistake that everybody can hit on. And it pretty much goes hand in hand with pillow shading that I talked about before. We always think, well, we can have, we don't want to have the, like, shades, like, how would I best put this? We don't want the shades to touch each other, like from like the next darkest down or something like that. So we think, oh, we'll just make them gradient up. This looks really bad and has a tendency to like destroy the what's the word I'm looking for? Goodness gracious. I had this written down. Why why is this the part that I missed? The illusion, the illusion that pixel art gives you, where you are trying to make things look good at smaller sizes. Whenever you look at something big, it's like, oh, that's fine, but like, it's like oil painting, where you're trying to make people see something from further away in order to get the full picture of what they're looking at. If they look at it too close, they're not going to understand. But point of the matter, we'll get to this. This
Hey,
also
James,
comes
really
down
quickly. We do have a question. Look at
Mhm.
it now, I think, before we go too far. Elaville on YouTube asked, would these same color palette creation rules scale for a larger environment / background?
Yeah, for the most part, I'd say. It's a bit different when working with background. I did have an example, but I couldn't find a slide to fit it in. The idea is with backgrounds is that you can go a little further with it, where like you can use extra colors. So if you want something to be really dark or you want to have more subtle changes, then you can do that. We will talk more about that once I get to the Clarity Bible section, because that's where we really talk about backgrounds.
Thanks.
But yeah, no problem. So with this here, like bringing back the situation of muddy colors from before, we have an example that was given to me from Andre from the Pixel Art Discord. I had like asked a couple people if they wanted to show anything for this presentation. On the old one there, the saturation is very low. The contrast is low. Everything kind of bleeds together, and it's hard to tell like where each shape begins and ends. And the eyes are like kind of hard to look at on Cortex there. And then we get to the new one that they made much later. They have like colored outlines in order to give them nice contrast. The shapes are much easier to read. The shapes are like bigger, more expressive, and the colors are much more saturated. This would allow them to look better on a background. Which then, no, we actually do have to do color theory first. This one I'm not going to talk about much. This is an entire talk on its own. This could take 30 minutes if I were to go into all of this. This is the most basic of it for like pixel art, and it's one that I usually see a lot, where you start from a yellowish tone or like tan tone, and then you move down to whatever would lead to blue. So if you're making something that's like a reddish or yellowish tone, you can move it over to green. And then if it's like a blue tone, you just kind of like make it colder and less warm and like desaturate it as you go down. Simple, easy way to understand it, like, but there's a lot more rules to color theory. And as a lot of people do worry about this, you don't want to be worried about like using photo references or anything like that. Never like directly copy anything, but it always helps to be able to understand um, what something looks like or how it should look in some way or form. My friend decided to let me use his funny Bass Pro Shop pyramids as an example here, where he was making a cyberpunk scene using, I think that's only 4 colors. I want to say he only did 4 colors with this. But yeah, you can see what he was trying to do with it and how being able to use the actual Bass Pro Shop pyramid allowed him to put it to a nice cityscape and make it seem a lot crazier due to that. But yeah. Now we're getting into the big boy leagues here, everyone. This is the thing that you need to know more than anything. And not only that, this doesn't even matter for just pixel art. This is for every game that you ever make. Visual clarity is paramount. You need to make absolutely certain that whenever the player is looking at something, that they're looking at what you want them to. So, for instance here, we need to make absolutely certain we're looking at what, the player and then what is the main adversary on a screen. Be that like a puzzle block or, an actual enemy or whatnot. These are the 2 things that are most important. And then coming after that will usually be enemies and stuff. We control this by using contrast, saturation, and value. Notice that the background is much darker and has less contrast overall, so that the player and the enemy in front stand out more. The rocks with the skeletons on them have less contrast as well, so that you don't end up thinking, oh, well, this is something I have to look out for. They're just nice details. But this is the general list that I have come up with from just studying things and like doing stuff on like different jobs over the years. First and foremost, player, obvious. We need to make absolutely certain that the player knows where they are at all times. The next thing is whatever will hurt the player or cause the player problems. As the obvious example here, enemy attacks and bullets and such, but that also can lead to puzzle blocks or, whatever else it is that you want the player to focus on. This then leads into enemies and bosses, which same general thing, but usually those are much bigger, and you need the player to understand where those are so that they can avoid them in some way. Next would be like any sort of foreground object or moving set piece or whatever is part of the user interface. This in a platformer, that would mean, like the platforms that you need to stand on and like what where you need to be moving and such. In any other instance, it's usually whatever the player is going to have as an obstruction. So, like, if you were looking at an isometric game, this would be like blocks and walls for buildings or like rocks or other things like that. Next would be like anything that the player is firing out. This doesn't. This can be flashy and cool, but you don't want it to get in the way of the other things. It needs to be a little more subtle, just so they don't get in the way of the player's ability to see things. Last thing you want is for them to get mad because all of a sudden they can't see the enemy bullets because they were doing something, or they couldn't see the enemy attacking because their animation was obscured. Stuff like that. And then everything else is just, like background elements, non-interactive elements. Those are all like come last. We need to make sure that those are the least important. You can have plenty of details and fun things there. Just make sure that they don't have too much contrast, because then the player will just immediately start focusing on them and not be paying attention to what they're supposed to be. Our key goal with games is to draw the eye where we need it. Thus, we get into designing for pixel art, which immediately goes into the same thing, but more about how do we make something smaller? How do we take something that has a bunch of details and make it work better? As you can see from this example, it's more or less removing details the further down you go, removing colors the further down you go, um, making sure that particular sections stand out. In this case, the top-down sprite here, I made sure that the hitbox was always visible by placing a white square directly on top of the head of the character. This makes this obvious, like we want to make sure that the player knows where they can get hit and where it will kill them, stuff like that. But, visually it just looks cool, and the rest of it doesn't get in the way too much when in a gameplay perspective. This is another thing that can come up where we really want to put a lot of detail into something, but by the end of it, it just looks really clustered and difficult to read. Very jagged. We can't tell what exactly is happening. Another example from somebody on Discord. I believe this was Pixel Joint that actually handed me this. But as you can see from this here, there's lots of jagged sections where it doesn't read very well. You can barely tell if the skull is in the middle of the head on the old one. The red spikes on the vines don't read very well because they're too clustered. There's too many on them, and the vines themselves are very jagged. And overall, the shape just doesn't read. You can't tell what most of it is. Then we come to the next one where the saturation and contrast is very high. The shapes are much bigger, so that we can see the arms correctly. The skull has got an outline around it in order to make it feel more impactful. It's now we can look at it and go, "Oh, that's a skull." The spikes on the arms are more pronounced because they're a bit smaller and there's less of them. So we immediately go, "Oh, that's got spikes on it. That's a threat." And then moving to the damage state of it, we can see where the arms have fallen off and there's little twisty vines coming out of it, and the skull has turned into a full skeleton sprouting up out of it. This is really cool. This looks great. We can read this exactly what it is without having to look at it too closely. Making sure that we can see this as quickly as possible is more important than anything else. And as I was talking about before, trying to make a design that's fairly complex from an illustration can usually be difficult. But it's not that bad. We just simplify the elements, take things out that don't read well at a smaller resolution, and change colors where need be, and allow things to breathe. In this particular case, I removed all of the muscle details from the character, just turned them into solid chunk areas. Removed the darkest shade of blue because it wasn't really useful here. It was just going to get in the way. Added white hands and gold trim on the feet so that the player knows exactly where the hitbox is at any given time. And also made the staff and the head much bigger so that the player can read this and understand, "Oh, that's a cute character. That one's the thing that we use to attack with." All of this comes down to just make sure your thing looks nice. Make sure it reads well. Yeah. Not much else to really say there. Now we're getting into the complex stuff that I have a hard time explaining. This is very visual information. The idea of anti-aliasing is something we probably know if we've played a 3D game and we've ever messed with the settings, and we ever turn it off, all of a sudden everything looks very jagged. That's because aliasing is when the boundary between two objects is not smoothed in any way, and there's no like slight gradient across the edges. Um, this is the simplest form of it. However, anti-aliasing also can go for like inner shapes and other things like that. The point of anti-aliasing in pixel art is we have to place this by hand, and it's entirely to make sure that we're reading this as something nicer and like smoother and rounder than what it really is. As you can see from the examples here, the point of it is to use color gradients to make things look nicer around the edges, at least in this example. You can also do this next to inner shapes and other things like that to get a nice smooth look to them. Another example provided from the Pixel Art Discord by Skimbos, where they showed me this piece they did 1 year prior and then the new version that they did. Notice how very jagged the other one looks. Granted, it's a lower resolution than the new one, but you still understand. Everything just doesn't really have anything to smooth it out. It sort of just like goes directly to the background, and nothing really hides the fact that it's pixels. You know, that's fine. Like, I'm not going to say that there's anything wrong with that. It's just our job as game artists is to create an illusion in order to pull somebody in. And so with the new one, there's lots of situations where they felt it needed to be smoother, such as along the brim of the hat, along the top of the hat. The scarf has a few instances of it. The line across here has a little bit of rim-like, but also a bit of anti-aliasing in order to make it feel smoother. If you were to zoom out on this, it would look really, really smooth. You could barely tell it was pixel art. It just looked like an illustration. And we need to talk about that because if you don't know anti-aliasing, you're not going to be able to do subpixeling, which is taking that concept and using it as part of animation. What exactly does subpixeling mean? Basically, it's faking the look of something being between two pixels. You can't actually do that. Like, that's obvious. But we change the colors slightly in order to create the illusion of something moving at a much slower or like smoother way than, you know, what it normally would be. This animation would normally be something like a 3-pixel bob. What I mean by that is like 2 pixels up, 2 pixels down. If you didn't have that, it would just kind of like look like it's jittering up and down. I see that happen in a lot of games, but let's see how we do this. I've explained a bit of it, but as you can see here with the white sections that I made as examples, we are using a little bit of the next shade down in order to make it look like more motion's happening than there is. This is kind of like a frame smear in a way, if you know that technique with animation. We are, for the up and down motion, you just have a little bit of lag behind with it. And some of the blue follows behind, kind of like a trail. The around one, that took me a bit to figure out, but it allows you to make it look like something is moving in a very small space. With that, you could probably do it in 3 by 3 pixels, and it would look really, really nice. The in and out for the foot and makes it feel like that the foot's actually bouncing up and down, and she's standing on her tiptoes as she moves. And of course, the left and right allows the cloak to look like that there's more motion than there really is, especially on the bottom of the cross section for her little nun garb. That's where I. How to best put this? It's meant to look like it's swaying, but there's really not a whole lot of motion going on there. That's just moving up and down 2 pixels. All of the motion is just like color cycling in this spot. We can also use it for much bigger motions in order to help them feel nicer when they're going as well. Such as on the hair here, we have a few little instances of color, like moving in and out to make her hair look like on the front look like it's bobbing around and moving with her motions. The arm here, this was the toughest one. The way that I did this was to bring in some of the lighter white colors to make it look like the fist is going in and out rather than just like forward and back. This allows the character to look like they're pulling their arms in and out as they're running. The shoulder bit here, as well as the staff, also feel like that they're like heavy, that she's having to do a lot of lag behind with it, just because this gray bit here has a lot of bounce to it from like cycling the colors around. And of course, there's a little bit of it going on here where I placed a bit of smear along the front arc of the foot when it's coming back. This then leads into dynamism. I don't really know how else to say it other than what I wrote, which is, this should pull out a gun bigger than itself. Having, like with all of the other things, they sounded complicated, and to a degree they are. They are time-consuming. But there are also ways to make really cool things without actually having to do a whole lot of work. As you can probably see from this example here, it is mainly just one big sprite chunk where they unhide sections, move them down and out, and it looks like a lot of big things are happening. It looks really cool, but they barely had to do any work to make this effect happen. The same thing with this crab here that I am making for my current job. This, I really wanted to have legs on it. They had asked me, like, can we get rid of the legs? I'm like, I don't think that really would be a good idea, because before I'd animated, they're like, why does it need legs? So I animated it, showed them that it adds a little bit of extra motion to it. It feels a little more lively. And by doing this, it helps to sell the idea that this is a much bigger thing, despite the fact that none of these chunks are actually animated. Everything is just a bunch of static sprites that are clumped together and rotated using bones. Having said that, this also comes down to like hand-drawn pixel animation, where the little thing can go a long way. In this example, this was my first pass on the roll animation where I hadn't added any extra frames for smoothing it out. Not much to really say here. But with this version of the roll, where the frames are much smoother, I initially couldn't figure out why it felt just not right. Something felt wrong. And it's because the only thing that had any weight to it was the head going forward at the stop. And so I decided, what if I just grab the chest and pull it forward one frame after the head goes forward, so that everything feels like it's jostling with her whole body. Makes it feel weighty, makes it feel impactful. And this is an interesting example I didn't know about until a friend of mine who plays lots of shoot 'em ups, even more than I do, told me about Battle Traverse. This game is insane. I don't really know how else to say that. They come up with lots of ways to make large static sprites that barely have any motion at all look a lot more exciting and like they're moving than you would normally be able to. And in this case, they use the background to make it feel like that you're in a hangar where the lights just came on and this jet just suddenly comes in and is chasing you. This is really, really cool. And I had never thought of doing something like this before. I highly suggest everybody, like at the very least, take a look at some videos of this game. It's doing some absolutely crazy stuff. I love it. But in conclusion, why does any of this matter? Why do we want to do pixel art? Why do we want to like make better pixel art? I mean, like for the most part, like what we see in a lot of indie games is fine, but I always want to strive for better. And we can learn a lot from doing pixel art that will then tie into our other skills that we use, especially if we do 3D or illustration. In 3D, we do have a tendency to want to put lots of details everywhere and like have a bit too much shape breakup. Sometimes it leads to the player just not being able to find a rest space on the model that they're looking at, especially if it's an enemy or something like that. I've seen quite a few games have this problem. So with pixel art, we focus on big shapes in order to make sure that we can read that. Through learning that, we can then take that information and go, okay, how does the 3D model look when we zoom it all the way out and see it from like the furthest we might have to look at it? Then we can start understanding how to create something that's reads better at any size and at any distance. And you can still have your like little details and everything too. And sometimes I just like to design with pixel art first in order to figure out what the shape should be. Like, again, trying to figure out like bigger shapes, and then I go up to get like more detail. Think about like how this thing should look, what its function should be a little better. Sometimes you just like think of it like a block out or a thumbnail sketch, which if you do 3D or illustration, you already know what those are. And we can also use this as a way to learn how to create color palettes better and how to better understand what we see and why we want to look at something in an illustration and we think, oh, that piece is more is exciting. You immediately are drawn to that. This can come down to like rule of thirds things, but contrast and like distance shading and like saturation and all that play a very big role in that. In pixel art, those things are absolutely 100% necessary, as I've explained. But in illustration, they can make basically anything pop. And of course, if you want to, you can just start combining the skills all together. Make cool little, like, retro indie 3D models. Stuff that looks like it's on the PlayStation and N64. People are really getting into that these days. I love it. I think it's great. By all means, like, have fun. It's very important to just, like, try, like, different things. I just... I probably should have switched to the other slide when I said that. But yeah, have fun, and remember, everything you learn ties back to each other in some way or another. I started learning, like, pixel art first, then I learned 3D, and through those two things, I learned how to draw better. Everything eventually comes back into a circle with skills. And that would cover everything I had. Feel free to ask any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. Applause in the background. Lots of good praise throughout for this presentation. A lot of these slides I consider invaluable. That visual clarity Bible by itself was worth the price of admission. And it's funny looking
Do
at some of
do forgive my stuttering there.
the great stuff. No, and it's funny. We start talking about limitations here at the end. You'll feel the pain of this story when we did the Warhammer 40K Final Liberation game. It was one of the last 2D Warhammer games, and it was for Epic, which meant we had to have their giant Titan mechs on the same screen as individual Space Marines and Orcs. So
Oh
we
dear.
went to our pixel artist and say, "Hey, we've done the math. Your orcs can be no bigger than 8 pixels." And
Oh. Oh no.
and Bryce Nakagawa did a great job with it, but oh, was he cursing us for a while. E.A. Laville says, great talk, thank you. She had a question. How does one select a resolution for the game they're working on and work ratio? So this is where the idea of limits came from. Back in the day, we had to do it based on the computer and cards we were focusing at. But now, how do you make that choice? Now it's more of a choice than a hardware limitation.
In all honesty, you still kind of want to follow those because, in my experience, it's what are you willing to put up with? How much work are you willing to put up with? And whether or not you want to like spend all of your time making really, really big sprites. Um, I don't shy away from big sprites. I think they're fun. I think they're like one of the most fun things ever. I don't expect many people to be like me. I'm crazy. Um, a lot of the time, I usually shoot for around 320 by 240, just because it's easier to like work within those limitations, and nothing gets so big that it gets outlandish. You can go for like a native resolution of like 640 by 480, depending on what you're trying to do. Like if you're doing everything as bone animations, or you're doing something that's like a fighting game, that might be better for that. But for the most part, I say internal resolution for your game should usually be around 320 by 240. That's what most systems used, and it works well.
All right, and aspect ratio 16:9.
There's something that fits around that. I cannot remember, but it's going to be the same like screen height of 240.
And a big part of this is, are you going to be mobile? Are you going to be PC? Are you going to be console? That still plays a
Yeah.
role in where are you going to target? Can you change it between those? Spire GG had a very sweet comment on a sprite. I recommend either compiling the source for a sprite or buying it. I used to make sprite sheets, and it's a big time saver. We didn't really talk about sprite sheets, and
Yeah. That's one that I didn't really like think to bring up because
such a
usually you
basic.
have to do it.
It's such a basic, but there is an art to that as well, to fitting the right amount of stuff on it and making them usable for you through an entire game development process.
Yeah, a friend of mine, he makes a lot of stuff for Mugen, and when you're doing stuff for fighting games, you're usually optimizing the sprites for like how big they need to be and stuff like that. Um, you can probably work at a resolution where it's like, oh, you could fit just about everything in there, but usually you want to like optimize it down and then make sure that the positioning is correct for it later.
And that
But
position.
like, oh yeah, you got it.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I didn't have anything else to
I
add. I
would say
just
that
heard.
positioning can be key, because I've seen sprite sheets that were so crowded as to be unusable by anyone except the person who created it. And you have
Oh
to be able
lord.
to hand off your sprite sheets, whether you're the only artist on the game or not. So
Yeah.
always keep that in mind, that your tools, your sprite sheets, your creation, someone else might have to at some point work them, and don't have them cursing your name every day they go to do so. one thing we didn't really talk about was working in teams, and we get so used to the idea of the sprite artist creating all of it, but that's not always true. Well, there will be cases on 2D projects where there is a separate animator. And there might even sometimes be a separate color. That's the tradition in comics. Anyway, any tips for working with other people, how to make them understand what you're doing, how to communicate what you're creating? Actually, that's important not just for other artists, but for the other members of the team as well. What are good ways to communicate what you're creating and what you're intending?
I'm going to back out of the like slideshow for a moment so that I can show a sheet that I made for, like, it's a personal project, but somebody asked me to make a style guide so that if anybody else came onto the project, they would know, like, what to do and stuff like that. Coincidentally, that's where I came up with the whole thing about the Visual Clarity Bible. This was mainly made to explain a lot of stuff that's just kind of in my head. A lot of what I was doing with this is I wanted to make the game look like Armed Police Batrider. So, like, you can kind of see where this is a shot from that game, and then this is the thing that I had created by myself. And it was mostly just going, here is a general guide of, like, how detailed to go. It's fine to add some extra little details, but don't get too busy to the point that nobody can, like, tell what's going on. You'll just make more work for yourself, and then nobody will be able to look at it. And the other big thing that I had was, don't be afraid to reference other games. Don't be afraid to reference palettes. Sometimes these things don't really make a lot of sense. And, you know, like, you have to really look at them and try to recreate them to go, oh, I see. Like with this bit of making the reflective glass and all that. Again, like being able to communicate this information is very... What on earth? What are you doing?
Well, we still see Don't Be Afraid. All right.
All right. But yeah, like, this is how you want to be able to communicate this kind of information to, like, other team members. And if they have any particular questions, you can help them with it and, like, you know, make adjustments yourself and explain how you did it. A lot of stuff like that.
And these are great examples because I've seen a lot of projects where the style guide begins with the concept artist and then the pixel artists don't come up with their own until late into it when they realize they need it. Or where if you're working on a licensed property, the style guide has been handed down from above, and those are not game industry pixel artists. And they're not giving you information you need, and you're learning on the fly how this can actually work and pass through licensing. So creating something like this, a major tool set for an art director is how do you create a good style guide, be it a 2D game, 3D game, or whatever, and one that's actually usable by the entire team. I think these are some great examples.
Thinking about that, I got really, really lucky on a Double Dragon Guide. I'm not allowed to talk about a lot with that, but there were... You can see this in the trailer. There was a particular note where no frame smears, and that instead everything would hold and, like, say a limb would shake for a moment and then go immediately to the hit. The point of that, I think, was making like attacks read better beforehand so that you can time it. I'm pretty sure that's the point of it. It's an odd choice, but it looks good. Nothing really bad to say about it.
Yeah, good to have that set well in advance. E.L. Lavelle has another question. Do you have tips for using subpixeling to bring backgrounds or environments to life in a game?
Oh, I actually did watch a video that someone made recently, actually today, talking about that. You can use it in little spots for, say... Oh, wait, no, I can... Yeah, let me pull up this thing because that's actually this is like the best example I have of doing that. Um, where are you? Where's the Samurai Punk folder? There you are. So a bit of that is going on here, where like these characters are basically just like background elements. They're just little tiny things happening where I just change like small bits of pixels for like the heads and the arms and stuff like that. You can use that exact same thing for maybe making like a grassway, or if you have palm trees, have them like move a little bit, stuff like that.
Excellent.
Like it is like very very like subtle movements. It's just, like for plants and background stuff. It's usually just like real small things for that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Very fun. Very fun. All right. I put out the call for any last questions in the chat as we wait on those. Remember, we have SimFest coming up this Saturday in Columbus, only $5. Got a well. I'm sorry that we won't have this presentation on pixel art there. We will have a ZBrush workshop. So if you've been wanting to get into ZBrush, know that you need it for your games, etc., come check that out. We'll have sessions on design, on the business side of it, the history of games, as well as chances to play testing. Oh, we'll have presentations on play testing as well as chances to play test people's games. So a lot of reason to be out there. Check out a whole new part of the Georgia industry. We got some thanks popping up on both Twitch and YouTube. So I think that's it for questions. I will say again, that Visual Clarity Bible was those 6 steps. Oh, I'll throw this out to you. You talked about number 2 in importance being bullets and like. My argument has always been it's whatever the designer wants the player to recognize as the greatest threat at that moment is number 2. But you're absolutely right. The avatar, what the player is doing in game is the number one thing people have to be clear on. If they're not clear what they are doing, where they are, they're going to get so frustrated with the game, turn it off, and return it.
Yeah, like the reason I listed bullets and stuff is because I really really like shoot 'em ups. So that usually what I'm thinking about is like, oh, this is the like the second most important thing is like, what do I need to dodge between?
Yeah, but if you've got a screen and there's an important fire, a player's got to jump up. That fire is going to look big and beautiful and be more interesting than anything else on the screen. Just that classic.
Yeah.
How do you put the player's attention where the designer wants it to be? And good art is key. One last question from NeoWare. What advice can you give to new game devs, especially how the game devs can communicate with the artists?
Uh, that's a tough one to answer. A lot of the time it's just be open to change and I don't like saying this, but like don't be afraid to kill your baby because it's not always going to be right at the first time, and your artist may notice a problem with the way that things are set up before you notice it, and maybe vice versa, where you notice something that they're doing. You have to be willing to accept compromises and what things might go wrong. Never get like mean about it. Just kind of like talk to them and try and figure out where you can settle as a middle ground for any particular decision that feels controversial in a design. So like if you think maybe the sprites are too big, or like something just is too weird, you can't understand what they're making, like be willing to go back and talk with them. Just like sometimes all it needs is like just a little change here and there, and vice versa for the game developer. They might notice something feels weird with like how you make something move and their animations aren't working right, like, stuff like that really.
No, I think that's great. And I'll throw in the other thing for new game devs: trim it down. This is great stuff right here, but yeah, make sure that what you're doing is obtainable, something you can do, If you have any doubt, start throwing stuff out and keep what's critical for a fun game. Always for the new game devs. Always looking too big. You want to create the next World of Warcraft. Trim it down. Make something really achievable. And frankly, a 2D game with pixel art is a great way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great note to leave it on. Thank you very much for a great presentation. We'll leave the VOD up for everyone to enjoy. If you have questions, you can follow up in the GGA Discord channel, in the art channel. So if you have more questions that come to you later, ask them there. And we appreciate everyone joining. And one more time, a round of virtual applause for our speaker. Yay. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be able to do this.
Excellent.